Welcome back to episode 56 of Winning the Moment. Today we have Seth Gehle from Beyond the Shadows, and I do need to give a trigger warning. Probably not an episode you want to listen to in the car if you've got kids or people who are sensitive to tough topics. Seth shares his story of child abuse and molestation, and it is a challenging story to listen to, but I think a very important one. And he sheds some light on some of the things that you can do to be aware of things like this, and how you can prevent it. And I think it's a message that needs to be listened to. But I just do want to give a fair warning that it is difficult. There's some very challenging topics that are spoken about. And so just make sure you're ready for that and in a good environment, and people won't be exposed to it who aren't ready for it. So that being said, I hope you enjoy this episode. Seth was so gracious and vulnerable and really an inspiration in his healing journey. And I think if you're ready for the episode, it's one you'll really get a lot out of. And I think he'll be an inspiration to you. So thank you so much. Please stick through to the end, like and subscribe. And most importantly, enjoy the episode. Wherever you are and however you are listening, thank you so much for being back with us on another episode of Winning the Moment. Today, I've got a special guest, Seth Gehle, with me. And this will be our first interaction, so you guys are going to get to learn right along with me. Seth was on Mason Sawyer's podcast, so if you're a fan of the episode, you've probably seen and heard Mason's an amazing story with us. And Mason has his own podcast, which I highly recommend subscribing to, the 1090 Rule. And Seth was on that, and I think he saw that I had Mason on and connected. And so, Seth, thanks so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate any chance I get to share my story and insight and a little bit of wisdom that I have.
Well, I think it's cool that you reach out too, because we were talking before we started. You reached out, got on Mason's, reach out, and got on mine, and that's what it takes. You know, I think if you're listening to a podcast and you're thinking like, man, I got a story to tell, or I would be a great guest, just reach out. I mean, the answer is almost always going to be yes, right? Like, I can't think of anyone who's reached out to me and I was like, no, I don't think so. And so it's like, just put yourself out there and see what can happen. And you've got your own podcast as well, right? Go Beyond the Shadows. Is that your podcast?
No, that's just my Instagram handle.
Okay.
Based loosely off my book title right now. So I'm very close to starting my own podcast. I'm really about to pull the trigger.
Oh, good for you. And so is your book out already then?
No, my book tentatively is scheduled for like September, October timeframe. So it'll be done by the end of this year for sure.
Good for you. How are you doing it? Do you have a publisher? Are you going self-publish? What's your strategy there?
Self-publish. Yep.
Well, I'm going to have to connect you. I've met some great people in the industry and some people who really know like the ins and outs of the self-publishing route, because that wasn't the route that I went, but I've met some amazing people, and there's so much behind the scenes work, like to hit that bestsellers list and how you set up your KDP and what categories you put yourself in. And so let me make a note to connect you. There's a gal named Ashley out of New York who's amazing. And then I've got a couple other friends who have had some real success going self-published. So I'd love to connect you with them and see if they can't help you on your journey.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
What's the name of your book?
We don't have a title yet. The editor, I should get my first pass back this weekend, I think.
Cool.
And so when she sends that back, I think she'll have a good idea on what a good name would be. I'm working with a company right now who basically has like a project manager who handles the book for me. As far as like kind of what you're talking about, the KDP stuff and all the marketing of it, and I have a marketing plan. So the editor, she'll kick it back to me, and I should have a title and marketing graphics probably the next 4 to 6 weeks.
Good for you. Well, let's be sure to stay connected after this. And so when you are doing that launch, we can reshare some of the clips from this episode and see if we can't help get some more purchases of your story. So I'm guessing the book is about like your childhood and growing up and some of that, the abuse and the trauma that you had and how you've overcome it.
That's right. Yep.
Well, let's get into it then. Let's get into your story and the nuts and bolts of what you went through. And I think it's so powerful when people like yourself are willing to be vulnerable and share your story. Because like I was just talking with our producers before the episode started, and you just don't ever realize that people have had these experiences. It's like people are passing you in the grocery store, at the mall, and they would have no idea, right? And there's so many people going through that, but if they don't have an outlet, they may feel like they're alone. And so I think when you share something like this, it gives those people who have had similar experiences the opportunity to know they've not been alone, and to see how different people overcome the traumas, and how you can heal. And I think, the more data we have on that, the better it is. So let's let it rip.
Yeah. So I guess I'll start off by saying, I want the listeners, and I want you guys to think about this as I tell my story. 1 in 4 boys and 1 in 3 girls will experience pretty much everything that I'm talking about here.
That's the worst part.
So
That's the worst
yeah.
part. Like, I've heard those statistics, and I have kids. I know you've got 2 kids. I got a son and a daughter. And so it's like, not only do I have that fear for them, right, and I do everything I can to protect them, but then it's like I obviously build relationships with their friends, and to know that
Yep.
one of them could be going through it, and that the percentage is high, because you said 1 in 3, 33% or 25%. Like, those numbers are way too high.
Yeah. And I'm glad you said the second part of that, of understanding that your children are probably okay, but they're friends. Like, they've got
Yeah.
friends who are going through this. And so
If they got 4 friends,
that's,
statistically,
yep.
it's going to happen to one of them, and that to me is what. And you wouldn't know necessarily either, right? And that's like
Yeah.
that's the scariest and saddest part to me.
Yeah. So my story starts off kind of quick. Me and my sisters were born at we were born back to back to back, right? So all 3 of us were born within 3.5 years of total. My mom, I think she had us at like 16, 17, 18, or 17, 18, 19. She had us really young. And then my father, they unfortunately get into an argument. They get into a fight when I was about 2, and he stabs her behind the ear and nearly kills her. So he goes to prison for that, and I never knew my father growing up.
How
I've
long
got a
did he
couple.
go to prison for?
I think maybe probably 5 or 6, 7 years, something like that.
Wow.
Yeah, I remember meeting him when I was about 7 or 8, and he was still in prison. And I remember meeting him in a cubicle, like going there, getting on the phone, and talking to him through the glass. I actually couldn't talk because I was crying so much. I was so sad. It was like a very emotional moment for me. But I never really knew my father growing up. And even after meeting him in prison, he got out a little bit after that. And I'm 29 years old. I've probably spent less than 100 days with my father, like in
Wow.
person, my whole life.
Well, and
But
really quick, hearing you talk about that, and like preparing for today's episode and watching some of your content, I think that is such an issue for us here in America, is fatherless homes, right? Like, when you don't have a father in the household, the odds of those children running into obstacles is infinitely higher. Like, if there's anything we could solve as Americans, that's probably one of the most important things to get right.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. That's the fatherless household. The American household in general, even with fathers, if we just fix the American household,
Yeah.
we're going to fix a lot of problems. But I could talk about parenting all day long. That's a whole other beast that I could get into, because I have my methods, and I have my beliefs and how to raise strong, resilient children, and other people have theirs. But nonetheless, the American household in general just is suffering right now. But yeah, when you grow up without a father, you're already subject to, like you said, you're more likely to become a drug addict, alcoholic, abused, several gangs, violence, anything. You're automatically subjected to these higher percentages or statistics. So the first, when you're growing up with a single mother of 3, she had to work all the time. She couldn't afford a lot of things. And so that meant that we were in babysitter's care a lot, and we moved a lot. So we were always in a new home all the time. And by the time I was 5 years old, unfortunately, I was molested a few times by a babysitter's son. So this kid was like 14 or 15, 16 years old. And that basically consisted of like him exposing himself to me, a little bit of touching. Wasn't anything like extreme, I'll say, in regards to being molested goes.
When that happened to you at 5, did you know
Mhm.
it was wrong, or did you have an outlet? Like, how did you handle that when you are only 5 years old? Like, how can your little brain even process what's going on?
Yeah, when you're that age, I remember just kind of like not. I knew maybe I knew it was wrong, but it's almost like lying to your parents for a piece of candy. Maybe like it's wrong, but
Yeah.
it's like not that big of a deal. Like I just felt like it wasn't that big of a deal. I
Okay.
didn't enjoy it. I didn't like want to do it, but it didn't bother me. Maybe I'm not really sure.
Well, and you
That's a
only know
hard.
what you know, right? So if
Yeah.
that's all you're exposed to, you're all you can be left with is like, this is just what life is. This is just how people
Right.
act, you know?
Well, yeah, and at that same time, about the same time that happened, um, my my mother, she would work all day, and if we were home alone, we ended up finding like this big stash of her porn, basically. And so at 5 years old, I was exposed to that, and we were watching it. And so once again, at this real young age, I already knew what all this stuff was, and I knew like that people do these things. I
That
didn't
actually makes
understand.
that makes more sense because you were
Yeah,
desensitized to it, right? Because it
exactly.
wow.
Yeah, so it's that really messed me up as a young man seeing that stuff, because even at 6 years old, I tried to have sex with a girl in my closet who was
Wow.
my age, and my mom called us, and she whooped me for that, and rightfully so. But I was just doing what I thought like you were supposed to do. I
Sure.
was, I knew we weren't supposed to do it. That's the reason why we were in the closet. But like, it messes you up. Basically, is what I'm getting
Yeah.
at.
I mean, that's so crazy to think, cuz so my son's 7 now. And so to
Yeah.
think of him thinking of that, it's like that's well,
Yeah, man. So as the years went on, we continued to move, we continued to bounce around. We lived with a bunch of different people, random people, babysitters, all these different things. My mom would be gone for a few weeks at a time, where she was like living by herself, and we lived with other people. And so it was just we never had a stable household, and I never realized how bad that was as a kid.
yeah.
Now I do understand it. That stability is extremely important for a child. So
Yeah, I just wrote
um,
down stability on my notes cuz it's like how
yeah,
can you ever progress if you don't have that sanctuary,
yeah,
and that routine and stability in your life?
right. And so unfortunately, by around 8 years old, 9 years old, my mom, she was smoking weed all the time, which was, 20 years ago, that was a really big deal.
Yeah.
Um, but she was smoking a lot. She was drinking a lot of liquor, and there was always people at our house smoking and drinking. And eventually, my sisters would start to do it. My sisters, like I said, I'm the middle child, and I remember being about 9 or 10 years old and seeing my older sister in the living room with a bunch of adults smoking weed. And because when you grow up like the way we did, where you're cooking your own food, doing your laundry, you're taking care of yourself, you start to feel like an adult at a really young age. And
Yeah.
so that's kind of what was happening. My sister was smoking weed with all these adults. And I just remember thinking to myself at that time, I'll never do that. Like, I'll never be a part of this life. Like, I'm going to do amazing things with my life. And this, I don't know really where that came from, the like intestinal fortitude that I had, but
Well, I
I just knew I
noticed
wasn't.
you had in your like one promo video, you talk about that you don't do drugs and you don't drink, which I feel like oftentimes is uncommon for people in your situations and dealing with the levels of trauma that you had. And so it's
Yeah.
interesting because obviously you and your sister grew up in the same household, and it would be so easy to go that route, and you opted to do the opposite. It's so
Yep.
interesting because your upbringing was the same, but your decisions were different.
Yeah, completely different. So I was a straight A student. I was, I got in a lot of fights, and I was like the class clown, but I was a perfect student. I mean, I was very smart as a young man. I never had to study. As a matter of fact, I was kind of a smart ass in most of my classes, where I wouldn't pay attention, where I would sleep intentionally. And I would still be the first one done with my test, first one done with any of the work, and I had perfect grades. So naturally, I was just very smart growing up, and that was obviously helpful. But um, yeah, I don't really know what the difference was between me and my sisters, and why they took one path and why I took another.
Did they both
I
go
don't.
down the drugs and alcohol path?
Yeah, yeah. So even today, I'm not. I don't know what they're doing now. I don't really have a relationship with them anymore. But our lives are drastically different, is what I'll
Yeah.
say about that. So where I'm married with children and I have a very nice house, nice cars, nice life. I can't say the same about the rest of my family, you know.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, but yeah, around that like 9, 10 years old, my mom, she's smoking and drinking a lot more, and then she started getting more abusive. So she was like close hand punching us in the face. She used to like grab me by my face a lot. She had these long nails, and so she'd grab me by my face and slam my head against the wall. And you know, she smoked a lot and drank a lot, so you could always smell that in her breath. It was just, I just remember these things. It was really, really nasty.
Did
And the
you have
worst part of it,
anybody you could go to in moments like that? Was there any adults in your life that you felt like cared, or
nobody.
you could, no one?
Yeah, nobody. That's the worst part about it is that's the reason why I do what I do now is because as a kid, if I would have just had like a strong man to come to me at a school or somewhere and been like, look,
Yeah.
man, I get it. I know what you're going through because people would tell me, hey, you need to do this or that, but they'd never been through it. They'd never experienced it. So I just never believed them. I'm like, you don't even know, you don't know what I'm going through. You don't know what this is
Yeah.
like. So how are you going to weigh in on what I need to do? So as an adult now, I can relate to so many kids. I can tell them like, look, I actually understand what you're going through.
Yeah.
And here's how you can save yourself. And, you know, it helps. So, but as a kid, I didn't have anybody, you know, I had, and with that too, like there were signs that were shown. So we'd always talk to CPS at school.
I
Children
wondered
Protective
if like it
Services.
was, you know, if it was
Yeah.
visible that you were being abused, and if any of the like the teachers or any parents around you ever like raised that concern.
Yeah, they did, and we talked to CPS, and but the problem was is my mom had us brainwashed where she would tell us all the time, what happens in our house stays in our house, and that was it. So we never told anybody anything, and we would tell the CPS people right to their face, like it's none of your business. You don't need to know what's going on in my house, and all they're trying to do is save us and protect us, you
It's
know.
interesting how
And
brainwashing works like that, you know, because like you needed help and you knew it, but yet you were brainwashed to believe like we got to keep it in our house, you know?
well, it's the same thing even nowadays. Like people tell you to go see a doctor, right? Um, even today, I don't know that I could actually tell a doctor what's going through my head because of the legality of things. Like I don't want to be reported for anything. I don't
Yeah,
want to be on a watch list. I don't want to be
sure.
fired from my job because of the legality. Like they say, like, hey, you tell me whatever's on your mind, and you tell them what's on your mind, and then they're like, okay, wait a minute, this guy's crazy. So like that's the scary part about being a kid too. But then
Yeah.
even being an adult now, they're like, hey, you need to get therapy, you need to get help, and it's like, okay, I'll go get help. But when you go get help, sometimes that help is like they put these restraints on you. Or so it seems. It seems like it'll be that way. I don't know how true that is, but it seems like if I actually went and told people what's going through my head on a daily basis, sometimes, then they may think otherwise. You know, maybe I don't. You know, I'm
Well,
not too
and
bad now, but I used to be really bad a few years ago.
that's
So
what that's what like podcasts are, right? Like like Mason talked about having his podcast and having that outlet has helped him process the trauma so
yes,
much, right? Because you're just having a real human connection with someone, and having an opportunity to share your story and talk through it. And that in itself is so healing.
yeah, that's exactly why I started telling my story the way I do now because for so long I kept a big part of it under wraps, like a secret, because I didn't want anybody to know because it's very shameful. But like 5 months ago, I started listening to podcasts, and I'm like, okay, so like even Mason, for example, me and him are nothing alike. We have completely different families,
Yeah.
completely different trauma, but me and him have the same exact feelings post traumatic
Yeah.
event, you know? So that means that we can heal the same way, we feel the same way, so we can use each other to heal and grow and do better. I actually just texted him this morning, and I just told him, hey man, you know, I love you, and I hope you're doing good, and things like that, you know, because I know he's still hurting and I'm
Yeah.
still hurting, you know.
Right.
So, anyways, that's the power of the podcast and the human relation, you know. So it's really powerful. But um,
So back to this
yeah,
time. So you're 9 years old. Drugs are bad. Physical abuse is getting worse. CPS is
yep,
talking to you, but you guys aren't letting them know that anything's wrong in your house.
right, yeah, and you know, things would keep getting worse and worse. And about the same time, I end up meeting this man through a friend of mine. And this man is like in his 30s. He was 6'5", 380 pounds. He's this big Hispanic guy.
And are you 9-ish at this time?
Yeah, I was about 19 years
Okay.
old. Yep. And I met him at my friend's house, and he asked me if I like football and video games and things like that. And I'm like, yeah, of course. So he invites me to come to his house with my friend to play video games and eat pizza, drink pop, and have a good time. So I go home and I ask my mom. And I said, hey, can I go to this guy's house? And she says yes, as long as you're with your friend. So I said, okay, cool. So I go to his house, and over the next 3 months, my life kind of really, really went down a bad path. He was starting the grooming process with me, which I did not understand or realize. And then also, my mom ended up meeting this guy who was actually a pastor at her church who got her addicted to crack and cocaine. And
Wow. And
so,
he was a pastor at your church.
yeah, he was like the head dude at I don't know what they call him. I think it's the pastor, the head guy at the church. And my mom meets him. They start dating. He gets her on crack and cocaine. We move into this house that was just a miserable experience. I was put up in my bedroom that had hardwood floors, and the hardwood floors were like buckled all the way across the floor because they were exposed to weather. Because my ceiling in my bedroom had a hole that was like 2 feet wide, about 4 feet deep, and so I could look up and see straight into the attic above. Um,
Wow.
and so it would rain and snow, and the weather would come straight into my bedroom. Um, and so like we put a plastic tarp over it to kind of protect me, but it didn't really do much. It was freezing cold in there. I slept on this little like 2 3 inch mattress with a thin little blanket, and I basically from the time I was 10 to 12, I lived in that house, and I pissed the bed every night. I wanted to kill myself every night, and I just wanted to die. So,
So you
and
were
then,
already between 10 and 12 having suicidal thoughts.
oh yeah, oh yeah,
Was
like
it,
bad.
what do you think was the driving force of that? Was it your home situation, or was it the grooming that was taking place? Like or was it just a combination of everything?
Yeah, it was a combination. Yeah, it was a combination of it all because, Monday through, so I tried to tell people I was living like these lives at the same time. It wasn't one and then the other. So, Monday through Friday, I'm at home with my mom, going to school, being bullied, coming home, seeing drug addicts in my house. Like at 10 years old, I would see people passed out on my couch that were high on crack or cocaine. And I mean, just like shaking like zombies. It was insane to see at that age, up at, 11, 12, 1 o'clock at night. And so Monday through Friday, I was dealing with that. And then my mom was being very abusive, and it was just an insane place to live as three little kids. And then Friday night and Saturday night, I was going to this guy's house, and about 3 months into knowing him, that's when the molestation had began. And so, yeah, it escalated very quickly. So that's,
I think if you're comfortable, what would be important? I think there's a couple things here. Because one,
yeah.
like obviously, it's never okay for a 10-year-old to go hang out with a 30-year-old, regardless
Mhm.
of gender. Like that's never okay. But if you're willing to talk about like what that grooming process looked like, because I'd imagine most people don't know. And so it's easy to think like, how could you let that happen? But it's because of the process you went through. So if it's not too much to ask, if you're willing to share kind of how he was able to build that trust with you, because I think as parents or as people, those are the things we need to know so we can try and prevent it.
Yeah, I think grooming is it's actually a really interesting topic in a weird way because it's much like interrogation with a cop. So when a cop is trying to get a criminal to confess, the number one thing that they have to do is build commonality and be relatable to this person. That's generally from what I've seen and heard, they have to be relatable and build commonalities to get this person to admit to what they had done. So a pedophile predator works the same way. They work into these commonalities. So we both like video games. We both like football. We like hard rock and pizza and pop. And so when I went to his house, those were the things that were provided. It
And
was
really,
a
that was
safe.
probably like your happy place, right? Because you
Oh
had this
yeah.
terrible home with all these drugs. You probably were looking forward
Oh
to
yeah.
the escape of his house.
Yeah, like when I went to his house, I was super excited. I was like, "Oh my god!" Like the first time I went there, I was like, "Dude, there's like three TVs, three video games, two computers, a big table for like we played D&D, like the Dungeons and Dragons stuff." So it was like this like kids haven. There was no rules. You could stay up as late as you want. You could cuss, eat pizza, drink pop. there was just no rules. And so it was awesome. And I would talk to him a couple times a week. It went from like once or twice a week to pretty much every single night. I would call him on the phone, and he knew that I was a fatherless child in an abusive home with, living in poverty. So he knew I needed him. He knew I
Yeah.
needed an escape. So that's really the biggest thing, is that's the reason why it's so important to have a father, and a present father, and a protective father, because that's one of the first things they look for is, does this kid have a father? Is there a threat to me?
Yeah, because I'm never letting my
And,
kid go to a 30-year-old
yep,
guy's house, right? Like that's never.
yep,
And even if he even asked to do that, it would be a problem.
exactly. And so that's the first thing they probably acknowledge and recognize. And then what he did, which I don't know how true this is or not, but he would relate to me. So he would tell me he was abused. He would tell me his mom didn't like him. He would tell me his mom was abusive. And so we were on the same page, right? I had an abusive mom. He had an abusive mom. He had sisters. I had sisters. His family didn't like him. And I didn't really think that my family didn't like me, but, there was that woe is me, right? I
Yeah.
was sad. And so he was sad too. And I didn't have anybody to love me in my life, and neither did he. So who's going to love him? Well, or who's going to love me? Well, maybe he will, and then vice versa, right? So he starts to tell me that he loves me, and then I start to reciprocate those same words to him as a 10, 11-year-old boy. I'm telling this grown man that I love him
When
over
you
the
were
phone.
saying that as a 10-year-old, what did it mean to you? Were you saying you love him like a son would love a father? Or were you saying, I love you like a lover would love a lover?
I was saying it to out of guilt.
Got
I
it.
was saying it like when somebody tells you have a good day and you say you too. It was just something that you just
Got
say.
it. Just what happened in the
Um,
relationship.
yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So I was just saying that as returning the message. Essentially, it was there was no feeling behind it. As a matter of fact, I hated it. I hated saying it. I hated doing it. I hated like every bit of that. So, but you get into this like psychological war with an adult who is a manipulator, a master manipulator.
Yeah.
And so they're just going to win. Like little kids, you can pretty much convince them to do anything because they have this innate trust in adults.
Yeah.
It's just
Well,
they don't know any better.
and even for you, I'd imagine, like, even though you hated saying it, you probably felt compelled that you had to because you didn't want to lose the opportunity to go to this place that was the best place you could go to, right? Like that was a
Yeah,
small price to pay, the couple words to get access
yeah,
to him and to his
yeah,
house.
yeah. Exactly. That and a lot of people even ask me like, well, why did you keep going back after maybe the first time he touched you? And it's like, even the first time he touched me, um, this is part of the grooming process, right? So he would, you go from giving hugs to, I think, I think I started sitting on his. I'm actually starting to remember this just now. I've actually never captured this moment in my head before, but I think I started to sit in his lap because his apartment, he lived in the studio, and it was always freezing cold in there. He always kept it really cold. He's a big guy, so he was always hot. So he kept it cold, and he always had a blanket. And I think he used that blanket to like lure me into his lap, where he's like, "Oh," because I would say I'm cold, and I think he would say like, "You want to sit with me and you cuddle up, with the blanket." And so I would start to sit in his lap, and I never thought anything of it because he's this massive guy. I was this tiny little boy, and I was just like, okay, whatever. I'm just sitting in his lap and going to stay
Yeah.
warm.
Yeah.
Um, because once again, he was 6'5", 380 pounds. He was a massive guy, and so I would start to sit in his lap more and more, right? And then he would have, like for example, the first time he touched me, his left hand was on my left hip, and it kind of grazes my butt, and he says, "Oh, I'm sorry," and I'm like, oh, "Not a big deal, like whatever." I attributed it to like me and you bumping each other in the hallway,
Yeah.
like it's okay.
Yeah.
And so he puts his hand back on my butt, and he says, "So it's okay if I put my hand here?" And you freeze. You always do. It's just a response. I froze, and the way I kind of feel about that is like when you're on the last click of the roller coaster, and you look down, and it's like, oh, this is the ride we're taking. Like it's about to happen.
Yeah.
And that's how I felt at that moment. Like when he put his hand on me and he said, so this is okay.
Is that the first time like you consciously were
Mhm.
like, oh no, this
Yep.
this is not good now?
Yeah, that was the first time. And I didn't do anything about it, unfortunately. And I knew where it was going to. Like I wasn't dumb. I was very aware of what was about to happen to me. At that point, I would say maybe the 3 months prior, I was oblivious and naive. But right
Sure.
at that moment, I was like, oh my God, like this is about to happen to me. And, it did. And so from there on forward, every week, because I would go to his house
Did it
every
progress
single weekend.
that quickly from like hand on your hip, is this okay, to instantly more?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. It's like, I don't know if other people experience this, but when you kiss a girl for the first time, then it's immediately like, oh man, I got my first kiss. And then for me, I was very sexually motivated as a young adult because
Right.
I do all these
And
things.
what you're exposed to. Yeah.
Yeah. So as soon as I would kiss a girl, I'd be like, we're going to have sex now. Like that's just
Yeah.
what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it was very quick. It went so when I first started going to his house for the first 3 months, there was nothing other than like the psychological things that were slowly happening
A question I
to
have
get me.
too is, you in the beginning, your friend was going with you. Did he stop
Mhm.
going with you at some point?
Yeah, he did. He was like 5 years older than me. So, he stopped going up there probably around within about a year or so. But at this point, he was still going up there. As a matter of fact, he was there the first time he touched me. He had just left to go get some tacos, and then when he came back, the guy moved his hand. But he would be there a lot, and then even
Did he know what was going on?
now
Wow.
oblivious to the fact of what was happening, and um, yeah, just real naive and oblivious to it all. So I was like 10, so I think he was 16 when this was all going down, and um, uh, so the first like 3 months, it was a lot of video games. Like I'd go to his house and we'd play video games most of the time, and then after he started, molesting me, it would be like an hour or two a weekend. Maybe an hour on Friday night and an hour or two on Saturday night, and that was it. And but then after that first time of touching me, within probably 6 months, it went from being like 2 or 3 hours of video games to laying in his bed for 3, 4, 5 hours a night. And he would talk to me. Part of the grooming process is like talking to me. He would tell me he loved me. He would, kiss me, touch me, like a lot of fondling, just like the general touching and cuddling, and saying things that are really heavy on a 10-year-old's mind. Like, you're the only thing that matters to me in this world, or you're the only reason I wake up every single day. You're the only reason I'm alive. And so like at 11 years old, I'm like, Jesus, like, what do you mean? Like, how am
Yeah.
I this impactful for you? Um,
What do you think
but
was
yeah,
it that did keep driving you back there?
man, that's what it is. They put all that weight on your heart and on your mind. It's like seeing a starving dog outside, or a hungry kid. Like you're compelled to go and help them.
Yeah.
And that's just how I
So it's
felt. I was
almost
like
like you were,
compelled.
even though you were being hurt, you felt compelled to
Yeah.
help.
Yeah. You feel compelled to go back. You feel compelled to help. And also like, I was also still getting to play video games. I was still getting to get away from my mom.
And it's almost
I
like
was,
that bad situation was still better than your other bad situation.
it, yeah, exactly. And they both sucked. So it's like Monday through Friday, I'm dealing with all this other crap. And then Friday night, Saturday night. And this was every single weekend. This was like 45 to 50 weekends out of the year. So I would eventually meet this guy's mom, his sisters. I would go to his family events, Christmases, Thanksgivings, birthday parties.
Did his family
And
think that was weird at all, that he was like bringing around a 10-year-old kid?
I don't know. I want to talk to him today and see what they thought, because I never got to talk to them after it all went down. But I'd like to, and I don't have any resentment towards them. I just want to know like what was going on. Like, did you guys ever suspect anything?
Yeah.
Because nobody ever said anything. I would show up and I was just his little friend. I'm sure the guys or the story that he would tell was that he was helping me, because I maybe my mom and dad weren't around,
Sure.
things like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And so he maybe was a hero, like, oh, he's helping this little kid out, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. You're probably
Um,
right.
and he was the guy. He was the life of the party. Everywhere you went, he was the center of attention. Everybody loved him. Everybody thought he was funny. Everything he said was right. He was very smart, which is these are all pretty typical attributes of a predator. They're personable people. You know, everybody likes them generally. So, but yeah, to answer your question earlier, the escalation of, I guess, force, we'll say, it was very quick. It went from just touching to inside the shorts to reciprocating, touching me, touching him touching me, to by the time I was 13, I had every single sexual experience, interaction, whatever you could think of sexually, I had done with this grown man by the time I was 13 years old, to include where he had finally raped me when I was 13. And that was certainly one of the worst nights of my life. And I remember that happening. I remember the whole process, being on his bed naked on my hands and knees and doing his thing, and then finishing, and the tension in the air of like where he was finally relieved, like a dog that finally gets to eat after 3 years. Like that's kind of
Yeah.
how I felt.
Yeah.
And, you know, at 13 years old, I was sitting on his toilet, like getting everything else out of my body and wanting to kill myself again and just wanting to die because I was terrified of somebody finding out that I did this with this old man, but also maybe I have AIDS, HIV, or some sort of
Yeah.
disease.
13, you couldn't even process all of that,
Yeah,
all of those
yeah,
things, right? I mean, there's so many things that would be going through your mind at that time.
yeah. And to make matters worse, like around that same time, my mom was taken away from me, or right before that, which I don't know if that's worse or it was a good thing, but it was a terrible traumatic event.
Yeah.
When I was 12, she stabbed her boyfriend over some drugs in the bathroom and set a bunch of stuff on fire in the front yard. And so I was at my neighbor's house and I came outside and saw all of that, and I immediately knew she was gone. Like I knew something bad had just happened. I didn't know what, but I was immediately hysterical, screaming, crying. It's funny the way Mason describes when he was on the phone and he got the news that there was this
Yeah.
wreck and there's one survivor, and he talks about being outside and he can't really remember what was going on, but he remembers like smacking the pavement and screaming and being, you know, just going through this rage. That's exactly how I have described this moment in my life, um, before I even met him, you know. But that's what it was like. I was in the street. It was a hot day, and I was freezing cold because my mom was taken from me. She was put in the back of this police car, and I'm like screaming, crying, panicking, and she's like looking at me through the glass, and she's telling me it's okay, like she'll be back, and this and that, and then she's gone. And for the next 4 months, I basically bounced around houses, living with random people, going to
Did
school.
CPS step in at that time to find you guys or what happened?
I, I don't really know. I like, so long story short, initially I lived with my cousins like a day, and then my dad came and picked me up. I lived with him for a month. I got into a bunch of trouble at that school. So I left him. I went back to my cousin's house.
What
And
was
my
that like being
cousins,
with your dad after not knowing him? And you're 13 and now you're with your dad. You don't even know him.
yeah, so that was, man, it was weird because you don't have any respect for him, and not in like a bad way, but I just looked at him like another person. Like he wasn't like I
He
didn't,
wasn't like your dad. He was just a man.
yeah, yeah, I didn't have like that father respect. Um, Kind of like my kids probably have some sort of like, not fear, but they respect me because I'm their father. There's like a certain
Yeah,
type of respect you have for
sure.
that figure, and I just didn't have that for him. And I
Wow.
wasn't rude or anything, but it was a weird time.
To think your mom and your dad both went to prison for stabbing someone.
Yeah, I never thought about that.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
Well, all this is
um,
happening. So all this chaos is happening. Your mom's now in jail. Um, are you still seeing, like, after that terrible incident with that man, are you still engaged, or did you cut it off after then, or when did that subside?
well, it was still going on during this time, so he kept tabs on me. So even when I was at my dad's house, like he actually drove like another like 45 minutes to pick me up on the weekends. So we just like kept in touch. I had his phone number, so everywhere I went, I just called him and said, "Hey, like this is where I'm at, and you can come pick me up on the weekends." Because I was still escaping like another hell.
Yeah.
I was just living with random people, and I just was. This was my only place that I could go and relax and be a little normal for at least a couple hours, maybe, and have
Yeah.
some sort of freedom in my life, whether it's playing video games or whatever. So I was still seeing that guy. But after about 4 months of bouncing around, my grandparents finally were able to get in touch with me, or found me somehow. I don't really know how they found me, but my grandparents found me and they took me in.
Was this your
And
mom's parents or your dad's parents?
my dad's parents,
Okay.
yeah. And so they take me in. My sisters were actually at their house already. I hadn't seen my sisters, so I was by myself during all this. My sisters went another route. I'm not really sure where they went the whole time. But I had not talked to my mom this whole time either. And right before my grandparents found me, my mom had actually called me. I don't know how she got a hold of me, but she got a hold of me. I was living with this family, and she said she was going to come and pick me up. And at 12 years old, I could have just gone right back to my mom and gone back into this hell of a life. But I actually ended up telling her, like, I don't want to live with you anymore. And that was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. To tell your mom at 12, like, I don't want to live with you.
Yeah.
I was terrified because she'd already beaten the shit out of me before.
Yeah.
And so, like, what happens if, she actually does come and just take me, now I'm screwed. And so she was on the phone and she was like, like, fuck you. Like, I'm coming to get you. You're my fucking son. You're my responsibility. Like, cusses me out over the phone. And I broke down crying. I was terrified. And like a week or two later, my grandparents picked me up. And they take me to their house. My sisters are there. My grandma asked me, "Do you guys want us to adopt you?" And I say yes immediately. And my sisters say no. They go back and they live with my mom. And
Wow.
I stayed with my grandparents. Yeah. And so um, that's how I ended up at my grandparents' house. And it was right about this same time, because I wasn't quite 13. This was like around Christmas before I turned 13 the next year. But it was right about that same time was the time that I was eventually raped for the first time by the abuser. So a lot was going through my head, obviously, Um, and so when I moved in with my grandparents, I still wanted to hang out with the guy. And I tell my grandparents, and my grandparents knew that I was molested when I was 5 by the babysitter, right?
Okay.
So they're like, no, like, you're not hanging out with this guy. And I kind of defend him. I defend him. I defend him. They say, okay, well, we need to meet him. So he comes to my house and he meets my grandparents. He makes them laugh, makes them smile, and he's part of the family now. And he would end up coming to our Christmases, my birthday parties, and he was part of our family, and it would just continue to happen every single weekend. Friday he would come and pick me up. Sunday he would drop me off, and it was a miserable time for almost 3 more years. So I was a
Wow.
month away. Yeah, I was a month away from being 16 years old, and I was up at his house with a younger friend of mine who was starting to get groomed. I could see it starting to happen, and so this kid goes back to his bed for the first time, and this was the first time that I had ever seen him go back there. So um, at that point, this kid was a couple years younger than me. I was like, okay, the buck stops here. Like, I can handle this, but I'm not not letting this
Yeah.
happen to somebody else. And it's kind of crazy to think about. Like, I don't know if I would have ever said anything had he not done that to that kid.
Yeah.
And so I ended up going home that weekend and reporting him.
Oh, you did. I
And
wondered.
yeah, so I was also molested and raped that weekend as well. And so I knew when I went home to not take a shower, don't change my clothes. Just I had to stay in his filth for the entire day of Sunday until I got home to report him. And so I get home, I report him, and when I report him, I asked so the kid who introduced me to him, like 6 years prior,
Yeah.
I asked him to come to my house so that I could talk to him about it, because he was the only person I felt comfortable telling. And turns out he was also molested and raped by the same guy for several years prior to me. Um, so we go out, we tell my grandparents, and my grandparents, we call 911. We go to the hospital, and they're like, okay, we gotta go get this guy. And so they're trying to figure out a way to basically arrest him today. And I tell them, I'm like, well, if he raped me and he molested me this weekend, I have his DNA on my body right now. Like I told him, I was like, I have not taken a shower. I have not changed my clothes. It's on me. And they're just like blown away because they're like, holy shit, like how did this kid who's 15 years old know to not take a shower, not change his clothes? And so they take my clothes, they go test it, they find his DNA on me and my clothes, and then they go and arrest the guy that night. And basically, like a month later, I find out that the guy pleads guilty to like 10 charges or 11 charges, gets 10 years in prison. That was in 2011. So he would actually be free today to walk around and do whatever the hell he wants to do. And what's really terrifying about that is a lot of things, but he ran a haunted house as well. And this haunted house that he ran in his hometown was on Main Street, and every single kid that lived in that town would come through the haunted house every year. And he would always be at the end handing out candy to all of these kids, so it's just crazy to think like if he would have gotten out of prison, like what else would have happened, or how many people were before me
Yeah.
and didn't say anything, or how many people would have been after me.
And he's using that haunted house as like a breeding ground to find, little boys who don't have that father figure there with them, or a supervising adult, or.
Yeah. So, fortunately enough, he died in prison in 2019. So he was a year away from getting out. He pled for parole. He was denied, and then he died a few months later. So he died about a year before he got out, and that was the end of his story.
Do you know how he died? Because he wouldn't have been very old, right? Would have only been like in his 40s.
Yeah. I've only heard of a staph infection. That's all I've heard. I don't know the details. I'm trying to get more information on him. I recently interviewed the cop who handled my case, so that was pretty cool. I got to go back to Ohio and thank that guy and shake his hand and cry in his arms and tell him that he saved my life and he did a great job. But also, I've emailed that police department and I've asked them if they have the footage from the interrogation. And I'm also trying to get more details on what happened to him. I don't know that they'll release that to me because it's technically not any of my business.
Sure.
So
did you ever talk to him after he was arrested? Did you have any communication with him?
No, that's one thing I kind of regret. I wish I could have gone to court. They told me at 12 or, I was 15, almost 16. They were like, because I wanted to go to court and I wanted to look him in his eyes and be like, it was me. Like, I got you.
Yeah.
And they were like, no, they said, you tell us everything that you need to tell us in this room and we'll handle it from here. And so I had to go in this room with this police officer and just basically tell him like the deepest, darkest, nastiest things that ever happened, which that alone, I mean, that's the reason why I'm writing a book, that alone, talking about the 6 years that I spent at his studio apartment would take me 2, 3, 4 hours to tell you all of these like just insane, like nasty, terrible things that happened to little boys, unfortunately.
Oh man, that's devastating. Did that impact your sexuality? Like, did you feel at any time during that you liked men, or do you still, or what was that impact like psychologically for you?
So I knew I wasn't gay. I know I'm not gay like today. I never had any attraction to men or nothing like that. But it didn't, what bothered me was that other people would think that, right? And so this thing has been a secret for 13 years now or 14 years now, because I've never told anybody about this until like 3 or 4 months ago.
Wow. So this is all new for you. You just started sharing this story.
Yeah.
What was the catalyst to that?
Well, I started listening to podcasts a lot about 5 months ago. And when I listen to podcasts, I've talked to Mason about this too. So once again, Mason has completely different life than me, but he has trauma. I have trauma, and he has the same feelings post. And so do I. And the same way we heal is by talking about it and by sharing our stories. And so what I've noticed is that as I've listened to other podcasts, I listen to a lot of Army podcasts just because I was in the Army. And so I listen to a lot of these like Afghanistan stories, which I love, but all these guys have the same post-traumatic thoughts, feelings, and things like that. And I'm like, okay, well, if I feel the same way they feel, and we don't have anything in common, then my story certainly will help somebody heal because their stories have
Yeah,
helped me. It's helped me
absolutely.
realize, like, oh man, that's what I was feeling, or that's what I was thinking, or that's how this feels, that's how that feels. And so, like 3 months ago, I reached out to my jiu-jitsu coach and a couple of my buddies who've got cameras and podcast equipment. And I was like, hey, man, would you guys be down to just sit down with me for like 3 or 4 hours and just let me talk about my life? And they're like, yep. So we did that.
Did
Went
any of
through the
them
one
know
and
at that
two.
time what your story was?
I gave them a brief warning. I was kind of like, hey, this is basically what happened to me, and we're going to get into it. Um, and they were like, we got like halfway through it. We get up to like go to the restroom or something. And I was like, man, does this kind of suck? Or is it like, am I dragging? And they're just like sitting there like, what the, like, they're like, how did you do this? Because this was like a 3 4 hour interview.
Yeah.
So I really
Well,
got into the
when
weeds.
and so are you now like at the start of your healing journey, or have you done a lot of work to get you to this point where you've got a wife and kids and a successful life? Like, did you do a bunch of healing up to that point, or did you just kind of suppress it and just push it down and live your life?
It's been a lot of suppression for sure. It's
Yeah.
like I've used it as fuel, but like internally, where like, I'll tell you this, it can be a powerful motivator. Like the thing you go through, you can be like, I'm extremely tough because I've gone through this and like nobody knows me and I'm this tough guy and I've got this chip on my shoulder and you can't stop me. And you can definitely build that. And that's what I did for a long time. But what I have found in the last 3 months by sharing my story is that the flip side of that coin, where you can say, I've helped all of these people, or
Yeah.
all of these people have said incredible things about me in my story, that is much more empowering than it is to say, I have suffered and endured and been through it all, and you don't know me, and I'm tougher than you. So by speaking out and telling my story, I've heard so many great things. That is more empowering than it is to suppress it and like use it as that internal motivation.
Yeah. Wow. Well, kudos to you for getting out there. And I know that, people are going to find this, it's going to make a difference. And I always say, if it makes a difference for one person, it's worth doing. Right. And
That's
obviously,
right.
hopefully we can reach more than that. But, I didn't know that you were just really at the start of your healing journey. That's quite fascinating. And even more credit to you for reaching out and being willing to share it. And so, how long have you been married then with your wife?
Um, 7 8 years, something
Did,
like that.
did
Yeah.
she know, or did you even keep that from her?
Well, I told her pretty quick. So we were dating for like 2 3 months, and I thought I told her more than what I did apparently. But as of late, she kind of told me like I did not know a lot of this shit. So, anyways, I told her pretty quick. I said like, hey, I'm jacked up, just so you know. Like, I've got a lot of problems. And what I really admire about her is that she didn't flinch. Like it was just like, okay. And she just was like okay with it. Because I've got my weird tendencies, I've got my anger issues, I've got my depression, and so I had to explain to her like why I am the way I am. And I told her, I thought, like I said, I thought I told her more, but apparently I was very brief about it. But like I
Well,
said, she never flinched.
and even then, like if you had told her 7 8 years ago, you just hadn't exercised those muscles of telling the story. Because even in
Yeah.
today's episode, you had a moment of like, oh God, I'm just now seeing that again for the first time. So as you continue to tell it more and more, there's probably other emotions, feelings, thoughts, or memories that will surface. And so I'm sure it wasn't even intentional. You just had suppressed it so much for so long that it's like you just gave her the version that got to the surface.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, kudos to her. There's not too many people that'll hear something like that and do what she's done for me. So I appreciate her.
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, it's so important to have a partner, and awesome to see that to go through what you did and to build and I think it's so important too, because people always, give the excuse of like, oh, look at their upbringing or look what they went through. And it's like, yes, of course, that would absolutely impact your life, but it doesn't have to define your life.
Mhm.
And so you took this terrible situation in so many ways. I mean, there's so many elements of your childhood that are traumatizing, And yet I've been able to put together this great life with you and your wife and your two kids. And so that's pretty amazing. And that in itself, like when you said that when people offered you support and help, you didn't even like trust in or confide in them because they didn't have the experiences that you were. So how could anyone really support you? And so now by sharing your story, you're becoming one of those support pillars that if someone does listen to this or finds your book or hears your story, they'll have someone, an outlet to reach out to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think that's the incredible part about sharing your story, when you share your story, you're able to reach people in a way that they don't understand themselves. And that's what I got from hearing podcasts and hearing other people's stories, as I would hear somebody talk about something. And if I'm thinking about what happened to me, sometimes it's hard to think about how I felt because I'm thinking about what literally happened and putting the literal actions and situations and circumstances to feeling is very hard to do because it shuts off one side of the brain versus the other.
Yeah.
When you start thinking about your really traumatic experiences, like it shuts off one side of the brain and it makes it hard to process it. So when you hear somebody else processing, it's like, oh man, like that's the words that I was looking for this situation. And
Yeah.
now I'm able to apply those words to my story and that healing process. So it's been the last 3 months has been incredible. My wife and I have gotten tremendously closer, and I don't feel like I'm walking around with like weights on my back,
Yeah.
and I can tell my story in its entirety now with no shame and no pressure.
Well, and you shouldn't have any shame, right? Like you were a victim, you know?
Right.
Did was it scary to share that story knowing that there's many people interacted with you in your life who would have never known any of this? Was that a scary and hard thing to do?
Absolutely. It was, yeah, if you go back, so I have a YouTube video, it's about 3 hours long on my channel. And if you watch that video, you can see and you can hear it in my voice. My voice is cracking, it's shaky. I'm fidgety, I'm moving around in my chair a lot. I keep adjusting, clearing my throat, I keep repeating myself. So that 3 hours, sometimes it's kind of hard to watch because it's like, oh my God, dude, like you suck at talking. And that's the first time I've ever in my life like looked at myself and be like, wow, I was really struggling. But I was, and the thing is I'm a Army combat veteran. I was in the 82nd Airborne Division. I'm a father. I'm a ultra marathon runner. I do jujitsu. So I'm a part of like a lot of these communities, especially like in jujitsu, for example. I told my story to my jujitsu coach, and so a lot of the people at my gym have heard my story now. And so when I go to the gym and there's 30, 40, 50 people on the mats with me, they all know my story, right?
Yeah.
And so there's that weird like, oh man, that guy's jacked up.
Yeah.
And it's probably just me having
Of
those,
course, yeah, it's your own internal
that,
thoughts.
yeah. But that's what makes it so hard is how do you tell somebody like, oh yeah, follow me on Instagram at the gym, and they see you working out and you're strong, and then they look at your story and they're like, holy shit, like this is the same guy.
Yeah.
So that was what was terrifying, and I broke down in that video a few times, and I just cried hard. And the first couple times I talked about it, I cried, and I was very emotional in podcast. But now, um, it's okay. I'm okay now. So it's been incredible.
Well, good for you, Seth. I mean, what an inspiration. I know that you're going to make a difference in people's lives, and I'm happy for you that it's a healing journey for yourself as well. Obviously, just in the last 3 months, I'm sure you've had immense amount of healing, and I think that's the power of human connection and sharing your story, and it's why podcasts are so popular. And I'm glad that we are able to connect, and I appreciate that you reached out. If people want to watch that whole story or just stay connected with you, what's the best way for the audience to connect with you?
The best way is Instagram, which is you can either look me up by my name or my handle. You'll find me either way. But it's my handle is Go Beyond the Shadows. And then my name is Seth Gehle. My last name is Gehle. I also have a website, SethGehle.com, and a YouTube channel. Same thing, Seth Gehle, Go Beyond the Shadows. And then my book will be out later this year. So that's what I'm doing. And I'm traveling and speaking and sharing my story and trying to, help kids and adults and everybody heal as much as I can.
Well, I love it. I'll be sure to put all of those links in the show notes. So if people who are listening, driving around, and you want to connect with Seth, you can do so. Seth, I can't let you leave without asking you the question. I'm really curious to your answer. But how do you define success?
Oh, that is a good one. Success is, oh man, I would say you have to achieve something, right? So it has to be achievement. It has to be part of the formula. Um, I would say it's achievement, maybe achievement, discipline. Um, yeah, achievement and discipline, and just those two things. I think with those two, because you have to achieve something to be successful, whether it's accomplishing money or a business goal or career goal or
Or a
life
healing
goals.
goal, right?
Yeah,
You're
healing,
accomplishing
right?
that.
There's
It's not
yeah,
surprising you say achievement and discipline with the military and jujitsu background, right? And doing
yeah, I
ultra
know.
marathons, two important parts of the formula for all of those things. So that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. So I think if you're disciplined in your life, and you seek goals and you keep attaining and accomplishing those goals, that is success. Success can mean a million things, but those two pieces I think are important to the formula for sure.
Absolutely. Well, Seth, thank you so much for being a part of the Winning the Moment podcast. I'm excited to continue to watch your journey. Real inspiration. Thank you for your transparency and your vulnerability. And I know it's going to make a difference. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of your week. And let's stay connected. I want to connect you with those self publishers and see if we can't help this book reach as many hands as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, sir.
All right, Seth, have a good one.
You do. Thank you.